Welcome everybody to the 2022 installment of the Sustaining Our World lecture in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences in the College of the Environment at the University of Washington. It's lovely to see those of you who are here in the room in person. It's wonderful to be here in person, but it's also wonderful to have those of you who are with us on the streaming video as well. We have an opportunity here to interact with a wonderful speaker tonight, and we'll have time at the end for questions both from the audience and online. This Sustaining Our World lecture is our annual event within the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. Every year we present a speaker whose work is at the forefront of environmental and forest sciences and also of interest to our broader interdisciplinary and societal collaborators and friends. So welcome. Before we get started, I want to start by recognizing that at the University of Washington, we acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land that touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. In our work in SEFS, which is our nickname for School of Environmental and Forest Sciences, we support stewardship, restoration, and management of natural resources and aim to build into our programs respect and reciprocity for the original inhabitants and stewards of the lands in which we work and the knowledge that comes from generations of land stewardship. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I'm going to introduce our speaker. Will speak for 40 or 45 minutes, and we'll have an opportunity for questions. For those of you who are online, you can enter your questions in the chat and just to the right of the video stream, and I'll present as many of them as I can to the speaker during the Q&A. For those of you in the room, if you'd like to ask a question, please come up to the microphone on this side of the room, and you can ask your question right into the microphone. And I'm really excited this year with our speaker. Normally, when we pull together this lecture, we invite the faculty to nominate speakers, and this year's speaker was nominated by several faculty members and several students from different corners of the school. We're a diverse place, but I would definitely describe this speaker as having a groundswell of enthusiasm from within the school. And so we're very excited today. And I can see as I've looked into her work why that enthusiasm is there. It stems partly from the good match between her work and the expertise in predator ecology in the Western U.S. and the work that's carried out within our school by our faculty, students, and the agency partners we have here in Washington. More importantly, though, I think it stems from her skills and success as a communicator, generating enthusiasm and understanding of ecological, environmental, and justice issues within the broader public. Dr. Rae Wynn-Grant describes herself as a scientist, conservationist, equity and justice advocate, and storyteller. She is a large carnivore ecologist with expertise in using field biology, statistics, and mapping to investigate how human activity influences carnivore behavior and ecology. She conducts research with black bears in the Western Great Basin, grizzly bears in Montana, and African lions in rural Kenya and Tanzania. A native Californian, Dr. Wynn-Grant attributes her interest in wildlife and conservation to the television shows she watched as a child. Dr. Wynn-Grant has degrees in environmental studies from Emory University and Yale University, and a PhD in ecology and evolution from Columbia University. She's currently research faculty member at University of California at Santa Barbara, leading carnivore research on the Jack and Laura Dangerman Preserve. She maintains a research fellow position in other organizations with which she's affiliated, the National Geographic Society, American Prairie Reserve, and visiting scientist with the American Museum of Natural History. Today's talk is titled Ecology, Evolution, and Intersectional Identities, Reimagining Environmental Education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rae Wynn-Grant.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much, Dan. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's really nice. I can't see your faces anymore, but for that brief moment, it was really nice to see your masked faces. To everyone who is tuning in on YouTube now or in the future. Also, thank you for your support. It's really awesome to be here. It's really awesome to be at a university, at a school full of students and faculty who are so thoughtful and so innovative, so friendly. And this is just a wonderful opportunity. So I have a lot to say. I always have a lot to say. That's just kind of me. And what I probably will be doing less in this talk is describing my research. So there will be a little bit of that because I want to start off that way. So there'll be a little bit of describing my research, but a lot of this talk is going to be about my feelings, my opinions, my ideas. And so I want to preface that very, very much of what I'll be presenting today are my opinion. Rather than facts, right? So not a lot of data, not a lot of evidence, but things that I have grown to believe that I really wanted to share with an audience like this one. In terms of questions for those virtually or in person, please feel free to prepare any kind of questions, whether it's a ecology and evolution research question, or whether it's a social political question, or an education question, anything like that. And so I'm going to, I've segmented this talk to be first about a lot of the research I've done, some of my career trajectory, and some of the projects that I'm just, super geeked out about. And I hope that resonates with you. And then I'm gonna tell a story about kind of a eureka moment I had, an aha moment where a lot of things came together for me. And then I'm going to talk about how I think we as a community, as an environmental and conservation community, can take small or big steps, but a lot of really small steps to becoming a more inclusive, intersectional, supportive place that ultimately will make us more effective in the work that we're doing. And so without further ado, let's dive right in. So I am a large carnivore ecologist. I have been doing really similar work in different study systems for a long time. And that's actually something that I'm proud of. I've been studying the movement and the behavior of large carnivores on landscapes that they share with humans for the last 16 years of my career. And I really, really love that. And so I show this photo because I have a GPS collar for a large mammal in my hand, and that's how I spend a lot of my time. When I fly home from Seattle, I am going to be right back in the field with a GPS collar in my hand, walking through the landscape, looking for large animals. But I didn't necessarily start off that way, as you can imagine. So when I was little, my family lived in urban places. I grew up primarily in urban environments, and I really find when I reflect back that even the few times that we didn't live in super urban environments, we lived an urban lifestyle, if that makes sense. So my family's culture was not one of being in the outdoors. So the closest I got to nature most of the time was making mud pies in the alley next to my house, like you see here. And yet I was really interested in nature, in wilderness, I would say mostly in adventure. I really felt that adventure is what I was seeing on TV when I would turn on nature shows. So yes, there would be, a lion stalking its prey, but there would also be a nature show host there describing it all on this epic adventure, and that's what I wanted to do. And when I grew up and got to college, I realized there was actually a science behind what I was learning on those shows, and I realized, oh, well, that's what I want to do. It's adventure, and it's also very, very purposeful, and it's making improvements in the world, hopefully. And so I'm very fortunate that I fell into that work. I am known a lot these days, especially in the Western US, for studying the movement and behavior of black bears. I attach GPS collars to bears in different parts of the Western United States, primarily at the human-wildland interface, and track their movements over time, and in particular look for patterns in hibernation of female bears, like the one in this picture, to see where they're hibernating, where they're choosing to birth their young, and how those hibernation spots relate to different distances from different types and intensities of human development. So for bears like this that make their dens and birth their babies right under the highway, which is super interesting, to the bears that get as far away from human activity as possible. I look for a lot of those patterns and try to understand those patterns and how they can feed into us making better conservation decisions. And so here I'm going to run down some of the research questions that I think are super interesting. So this is where I geek out a lot, but this is not the main focus of my talk. But because we're at a university, I felt like it is really relevant. So I worked for many, many wonderful years in the Western Great Basin. So a part of Western Nevada that begins the Great Basin of the United States. And I was looking at the population and movement dynamics of a recovering population of black bears. Super interesting for a lot of reasons, but one is that there aren't very many places in the world where we find that large carnivores are recovering. And yet, that's what we're all working towards. So being able to study a recovering population of bears was really fascinating and allowed a lot of insight and recommendations for other projects where the goal eventually is recovering carnivores. So, we're asking questions like, what are the dynamics of this recovering population? How do black bears react to patterns of human activity on a landscape? What are the geospatial characteristics of black bear mortality in the Western Great Basin? I put that question in italics because it actually feeds into the story that I'm going to tell a little bit later about patterns of black bear mortality under different human land use scenarios. And it was a wonderful time studying those carnivores. It was really, really interesting. One note that I want to give, because we're here at a university, is that I went into that study thinking it would be very, very strictly ecology. But what I learned very quickly was that it was a very interdisciplinary project for ways that might be obvious, but even some ways that I think are super surprising. So for example, we were looking for a lot of baseline data about, okay, we know there are black bears in Nevada today, but what were the numbers historically? And if you looked at the scientific records, black bears had never existed in Nevada before. So they were a brand new species to the state in terms of the scientific literature. But my research collaborators went back into old pioneer journals. They looked at the old newspaper articles from the 1800s when folks were heading west looking for gold in California. And they just searched through these old Western libraries for any kind of documentation of folks running into bears. And that's where they found the information. And that's where they were able to geolocate exactly where people were running into bears a couple hundred years ago. Information that was not available in the scientific literature. And so the baseline information for this high-level and long-term population study of black bears in Nevada actually came from pioneer journals and people's notes that were heading west a long time ago in these very obscure libraries. And it took many, many years of searching and reading and finding just singular words here and there that helped us piece together one of the original maps of where black bears were in this part of the western United States, which helped us understand that black bears used to exist in Nevada, were driven to extinction through overhunting, and then the population that was returning to Nevada was actually genetically linked to those in the California region that were coming up and over the Sierra Nevada mountain range and into western Nevada. And that's how the population was recovering in the state. So I feel very fortunate that early into this work, I realized that an interdisciplinary framework was necessary for us to have a full picture and a full understanding of what was going on. And that has really carried with me throughout most of my work as an ecologist. And so I had a really great time. I have to say I was taken to dinner by some of the faculty and students and graduate students earlier before this talk, and was able to chat with folks who use a lot of telemetry and use a lot of GPS points for understanding patterns in different types of wildlife movements. And those are my people, so it's always great to be around my people who do the same kind of work. And again, that's what I spend a lot of my time on. And I've been very fortunate that I study bears, black bears, and grizzly bears, as Dan said when he introduced me. hibernation patterns of female bears in particular. And I've also had the opportunity to do several projects in the tropics, in Madagascar, looking at lemurs and movement patterns and behavior of ring-tailed lemurs in protected areas in Madagascar, as well as different reptiles and herbivore reptiles and amphibians as well. And for several years, most recently, I was working in the northern Great Plains, in the landscapes in eastern Montana, again, looking at recovery of a large carnivore, and in this case, it was grizzly bears. So the story goes that conservation has been really going strong, I would say, in a lot of the protected areas in Montana. Yellowstone National Park, Glacier National Park have put a huge emphasis on conserving and protecting grizzly bears, and their population sizes have grown. They've grown a lot. And grizzly bears need more space. And so many of them are leaving the protected areas and heading east. A lot of folks, mostly in the public, don't realize that grizzly bears, wolves, mountain lions, used to be found primarily in the Great Plains, in those grasslands. They're not naturally a mountain species. They were driven to the mountains in the western part of Montana because of hunting and because the mountains are not a great place to do agriculture. And so the grasslands where bison roam or used to roam are the homeland of grizzly bears. And bison calves are one of their main sources of prey, you think. And so looking at how grizzly bears are quite literally walking on their four paws back east towards their homeland, I think is a very meaningful, very special pattern that we're seeing on the landscape. And it's being interrupted by what's going on with humans, with a lot of highway development, with a lot of intolerance, landowner intolerance to large predators, and a lot of barriers, even things like fences are getting in the way. And so I was asking different questions with conservation organizations in Montana. You know, what habitat corridors might these bears use to get from one place to another, and how does human development disrupt those corridors? In particular, what are the structural and functional barriers? We're always thinking about barriers and how to eradicate them. And then applied conservation, how can we use that to target and facilitate carnivore movement and successful recolonization of historic habitat? And we found that a lot of that applied conservation ended up being environmental education. So, you know, really teaching people about the benefits of having wildlife in these ecosystems and how restoration of these ecosystems back to their historic standard would actually be a win-win for all kinds of folks. And more recently, I am working in California, which happens to be the state where I was born and partially raised. And I'm working in a part of California that is new to me, the southern part of California at the Jack and Laura Dangerman Preserve. So if you look at the big circle and then I bet I have a laser pointer, right here is the Jack and Laura Dangerman Preserve, which is a very, very unique place. And if I had the opportunity to give a different talk, I would talk all about the Jack and Laura Dangerman Preserve, because it is a wonderful, relatively small protected area, but large in terms of the network of protected areas in Southern California, about 100 miles from Los Angeles. And at a point in the landscape right here, called Point Conception. And that's where the northern headwaters of the Pacific Ocean meet the southern headwaters and kind of crash together. And it's this really interesting marine ecosystem. There's a marine protected area just off of Point Conception here. And traditionally, for the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians, it was a sacred place to send off their dead in canoes, a very, very spiritual spot. It is an important place for me for a lot of reasons, but there is a really interesting, very dynamic carnivore community working there and living there. So some of my research questions that I am diving into right now, myself, as well as with my amazing graduate students, and if they're watching this talk, I just want to applaud them because I have the best graduate students. We're asking questions such as, how does the Dangerman Preserve serve as core habitat for carnivores? And how does it act as a really important node in connectivity of protected areas in the region? Do carnivores exhibit unique feeding characteristics in these protected areas? And let me give you a hint, the answer is yes, they do. So this area is super interesting in that we have oak woodland forest in the same protected area as we have an actual, coastline with beaches. And we have, this interface of sand dunes and forest land together. And what we're finding anecdotally, because wild animals have never been studied in this landscape until now, we have anecdotes of elephant seal pups being preyed upon by mountain lions. And if this is the case, it'll be the first confirmed scientific evidence of mountain lions coming to the shore to deliberately feed on marine prey, and elephant seals in particular. So my graduate students and I have just started this work, but we have set up a lot of camera traps to try to see where we're finding mountain lions. So we are absolutely finding them in the oak woodland forest and at the higher elevation areas. But this image comes from one of the sand dunes right before you get to the actual beach. And we're seeing these animals periodically come onto the sand, onto the beach in order to hunt, as well as other mesopredators, so bobcat, and you could probably tell it's walking right to the beach to take a dip in the evening. And, coyote with different seabirds in their mouth. We have a photo of a coyote with a sea lion flipper in its mouth. And then also things that are super interesting to me. These are black bear tracks seen on the beach early in the morning. And we have a lot of questions about, well, what are these animals using coastline for? How important is wild coastline for wildlife in California? And how might this information change how we understand protected areas in the state of California and perhaps in many different coastal zones around the world? So please stay tuned. We've just begun this research. This is just a little teaser. I think it's fascinating. I geek out all the time talking about it, but really understanding the unique, possibly never before understood feeding patterns of these carnivores is my current research. And so now for a little pivot, because I have been very, very fortunate to have spent a great career thus far in the wild, in the wilderness, having pretty amazing experiences and opportunities studying wild animals in their natural habitats. And it's been scientifically very, very wonderful. But for a long time, I felt that something was missing. There was a depth to the scientific community and to my work and to conservation as a whole that I felt was really missing. And I will share with you this story. So that's a black bear skull, or at least half of a skull, that I've had for a long time. And that black bear came from one of my early study sites. And there's a bullet hole in its head because it was shot. And that's what my finger is pointing to, is that bullet hole. And a big part of my dissertation research when I was doing my PhD was looking at the mortality risk and mapping, mortality risk of black bears in different parts of the landscape, and understanding which variables contributed more or less to risk of human-induced mortality on a landscape. And I thought it was really fascinating because the whole idea is to keep these bears alive, and this work was pretty awesome. It has been published, and we just think it's something that we're very proud of. And this photo is really relevant to me because when I was finishing my graduate degree, I had this great experience to go to a high-level ecology conference that will remain nameless, but I'm sure we all know about it, and present my research on black bear mortality risk in the Western Great Basin. I got a lot of support for it. I was really proud. And the conference was in Seattle that year. I'm sorry, I'm in Seattle now. The conference was in Sacramento, excuse me. I have Seattle on my mind. The conference was in Sacramento, California that year, and that was exciting to me because I had a lot of family in the Bay Area of California, so I could fly to the Bay Area, see my family, and then drive out to Seattle. And so that's what I did, and I flew out and spent time with my family, and then The morning that I jumped in the car was the morning before my presentation. And I was getting nervous because I had only done these little conferences before and I had never done a big one. And so I decided to turn on NPR, and that's because that was my confidence booster at the time. Whenever I felt like, oh, nervous, I'm gonna do an intellectual talk, I always thought to myself, well, let me listen to intellectual radio because that'll get me prepared, okay? I'm gonna put my Beyonce down for a minute and just put on NPR. And I was driving, and the report was that a young man, a teenager named Michael Brown, an unarmed black man, had just been killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri. And I'm sure you have all heard of this tragedy, and of course it was just another in a series of police killings of unarmed black men in America. And so I was driving, and I was absorbing this news, and I was crushed by it. And I was especially paralyzed because I was headed to a place that I felt was the worst place for me to be while processing these feelings. Going to a really big, really prestigious ecology conference in 2014 in Sacramento seemed like a cold and exclusive place. And I thought to myself, I bet no one's gonna be talking about this. I bet if some other national tragedy or, innocent individual had been killed, maybe it would be something that people are discussing around the water cooler or consoling each other about. But I bet this teenage kid and the fact that this black community in Missouri is quite literally on fire is not going to be a conversation. And I also bet that I'm going to be one of the only black people at this conference. And so if I'm going to do this, I'm going to have to suck it up and not talk about this tragedy and how it makes me feel and how it's the most important thing in the black community right now, and not talk about the mortality of black men, but instead talk to people about the mortality of black bears, because that's what they might care about. And oh my goodness, I was crushed. I arrived at my hotel that I was sharing with another graduate student. I told myself, okay, Rae, get in the zone, you need to practice. You waited to the last minute, you procrastinated, you need to practice your talk. And I couldn't. I was sad, I was crushed. I wanted to just race out and be in the streets marching and demanding justice. And the next morning I woke up and I put on my clothes and I put on a brave face and I went to the conference and I saw 0 other black folks, and I walked into my presentation room, a room a lot like this, and I gave my talk and I did a terrible job. I really, really bombed it. And I wasn't prepared. I was extremely distracted. I was dealing with trauma, and no one was talking about the current event of the moment. And I let my advisors down, I let my friends down, and I let myself down in that talk. And I kind of let that go. I left the conference, I was super mortified and tremendously embarrassed, and so I practically ran out of the conference as soon as the question and answer was done. I didn't want to face my advisors, I didn't want to face the other faculty members or grad students, and I raced out of there and I got in my car and I drove the couple hours back to the Bay Area and I sat with my grandparents and I cried with them. I flew back to my university and I didn't speak of what had happened. But a couple of years later, I had processed this enough and I realized this isn't going to work, right? Scientists do science, and science is pretty neutral. But scientists are people, and people are not neutral. And in order for any of us in the environmental field to do really good work for the environment, we have to know that ourselves and our communities are protected and are safe. Because if we're distracted by some of the basic human rights that our communities need, we're not going to do good science. We're not going to help the world, and in my case, we're not going to help the wildlife community the way that we intend to. So I began incorporating some of this messaging very sloppily into some of my public speaking, but in particular into some of my science talks. So when I would talk about black bear mortality and the different patterns of black bear mortality across the landscape, and how tolerance or intolerance to bears was related to different socio-political demographics, I would also slip in that, you know, hey, this isn't always so different when it comes to people. And that's important to someone like me who is an intersectional person, someone who is both Black and a scientist, someone who cares very much for this community and their protection, and someone who is dedicated to improving the lives of wild animals everywhere. And this came to me when I was in grad school, but to be honest, it should have come to me much, much earlier. And that's because when I was 20, I was doing a study abroad program in college, and I was living in southern Kenya, and I was living with a Maasai tribal group, and we were studying, the whole student group, were studying wildlife management in an area that was full of Maasai people living very traditionally and practicing pastoralism. Oh, and I loved it. I was having so much fun. I made friends with these wonderful people. I'm still friends with many of them. It was really what allowed me to have my clicking moment of, oh, I want to be a wildlife ecologist. And while I was there, about a month into my study abroad program, Hurricane Katrina happened back here in the United States. And I was in East Africa. East Africa did have internet at this time, but not where I was. So the only way that my family or any of our families could communicate with us was through written letters that would be sent from North America all the way to Nairobi, Kenya, and then it was like a 6-hour drive to get letters, and that only happened once a month, and so all this time would go by. And the story goes that I was, you know, just having a regular chit-chat one day with someone from the Maasai community, and a person came up and said, hey, wait a second, I thought you told us that like these days the Black experience in America was good. I was like, yeah, well it is. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's like pretty good. And he said, no, because haven't you heard all the Black people, they're dead in the water. And I immediately blew that off, and I was like, you know what? I have heard some crazy rumors from home, like through the grapevine while I've been here, but that doesn't make any sense, and so you've been misinformed. I don't know what that even means. And yet this person seemed really serious. He's like, nope, Black people dead in the water. And I let it go and I let it go until my parents sent me this Time magazine in the mail, which described Hurricane Katrina and the upwards of 1,000 people who lost their lives in the hurricane, who were primarily from the Black community, and the lack of response from our nation's government to help these people. And it was at that moment that I realized, oh man, here I am, really realizing, you know, in far off, you know, East Africa, on the ground, in the field, working with wildlife, really understanding that this is my purpose, that wildlife ecology is my purpose, and also realizing that my Blackness is going to be a big part of my career forever. Because once again, being from a community that is a target group that experiences sociopolitical oppression and is seeking liberation and justice is going to inform my science and my experience as a scientist every step of the way. And this is me coming from a Black experience, and there are so many people who have different backgrounds and identities from different target groups for whom that is also going to be the case. And man, oh man, how am I going to reconcile this? So coming back to really trying to figure out, how do I articulate this? How do I mobilize my scientific community? How do many of us from many different target groups learn how to mobilize our scientific community to do better, to show up, to acknowledge injustice, and to work really hard to incorporate it into the science? How do we do all of this without one, driving ourselves crazy, or two, blacklisting ourselves as difficult. And I'm really excited to be bringing these concepts to you all today because A, I know that they are concepts you all are familiar with, that you're talking about, that you have been aware of for so long. That's one of the beauties of this particular school that you're in. And two, because this lecture series is about sustainability, and it's about how can we do our work in a more innovative, inclusive, better, healthier, quicker, more effective way. And my argument isn't just for continuing to diversify this field, but to include justice and awareness and advocacy so strongly into the actual science part of what we do that it strengthens us and thus makes this work more sustainable. So, switching gears a little bit more, I'm going to offer a lot of some of my thoughts on ways that we can do this and we can become agile at practicing inclusivity, justice, and intersectionality in this work. And a lot of these things are painful or difficult or uncomfortable, but ultimately better. And I just, have to, one of my favorite quotes of all time is this one: "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." And I am positive that I do not have to speak to this group about intersectionality, but just for the record, we are all intersectional people. Intersectionality is very different from privilege, so we are people who have different levels of privilege in different ways, but we are all intersectional people. And bringing our full selves to our work, no matter what our work is, usually is a superpower. And I was chatting with someone at dinner earlier, and I really appreciated that she admitted that although she has different political views, she comes from a fairly conservative family. And so that is part of an intersectional identity. I am a environmental scientist who is very left-leaning, but grew up in a conservative Southern family. I am this person of this gender who has these privileges, and I'm also this. Using myself as an example, I am Black, I am a woman, I am a millennial, I am a parent, I am short, I am, able-bodied, I am a lot of different things. And each part of my identity comes with different levels of privilege. But accepting that intersectionality is the root of who we are and how, and the lens through which we work, and the strength that we all have is really important. And intersectionality can also show up in work. And sometimes we call that an interdisciplinary approach. But I would maybe suggest that we tweak that a little bit, because sometimes it's an intersectional approach that we're really talking about. And here's an example. Very soon after I made the connection that I was spending a lot of my time and energy talking to people who were excited about figuring out how to prevent black bears from being shot, and yet not super excited about talking about how to prevent black men from being shot, I stumbled upon this paper, and this paper really stayed with me. And it was because I was writing my dissertation, and so I was trying to understand the statistics and different statistical approaches, and I was learning Bayesian statistics. And if you know, you know, okay? If you don't know about Bayesian statistics, don't go down that rabbit hole. But I found this paper. And in this paper, the author is using a statistical approach that was very, very similar to the statistical approach I was using to analyze habitat selection of black bears in the Western Great Basin. But he was using this approach to analyze whether there was bias in police shootings of unarmed black people, whether black folks that were being shot by police were committing more crimes or were more likely to be armed, or if there was any other variable in there that could explain why they were being shot and killed more often. And he is someone who publishes on statistical approaches and has never, outside of this paper, published on anything race-related. He is a white, cis-het man. And yet, he took it upon himself to try these same statistical approaches that I was using in the wildlife science world to address these issues for any naysayers who, could explain police shootings as like, oh, they deserved it, or oh, there's a pattern here. And he was able to find that essentially racism is the reason that Black men are shot more often by police. With data from the regions that he was using, racism was the driver. And this helped me so much. It helped me see that there were people out there who were using intersectional and interdisciplinary approaches to talk about social issues that impact scientists and impact statisticians, right? So many statisticians were reading this paper, and all of a sudden, their work was being aligned with social justice and mission-driven fields. If you understand stats and you understand this type of bias, then you can understand that we have a huge social problem on our hands. And that is so empowering. And he wasn't the only one. So I was able to meet, and these slides are used with permission, a wonderful woman named Evening Star Woman, who is an Indigenous woman that is fantastic geographer, and she used a lot of mapping techniques that I was very aware of. So a lot of the same mapping techniques, again, that I used for wildlife, she was using for different environmental issues. And at the same time that she was mapping different environmental scenarios in the Dakotas, she was realizing that some of the areas of extreme conservation importance were also areas that had the highest likelihood of having missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The areas that were being targeted by environmental and conservation groups as, oh, we gotta get in there and do some really good work for the environment, were the same areas where no one seemed to be searching for these women who were missing or advocating for justice for these women and girls who had been murdered. And in the Indigenous community in the United States, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls outnumber any other group, any other racial group in terms of unsolved cases or people who never show up again. And so she started presenting this for every conference, for every paper, where she would say, okay, let's look at the maps of environmental issues and trends. She would also overlay it with, and this is what's going on in the community. So if you think you're gonna solve everything in this area by improving the natural environment, you're wrong, because you have to include these tragedies and this violence that is happening against women, Indigenous women and girls. And that approach was another affirming thing for me and for a lot of folks who are also seeking these approaches out, to say, wow, you can combine advocacy and social awareness into your actual science, into your actual data analysis every single day. Continue to make change for the environment while also making change and alerting people to what's going on in society. And a lot of my work now involves trying to create a comprehensive understanding in environmental organizations and in universities and with groups of scientists about equity, inclusion, diversity. I show graphics like this that I'm sure you all have seen before, but I always feel like they're useful to put in, where we have equality. This graphic isn't perfect also. There are ways to criticize these graphics. Equality, where everyone gets the same thing no matter what their foundation is or what barriers they're facing. That doesn't really work, right? And then equity is when people are given different tools or solutions based on what their foundation is or what barriers they're facing. And that is a really strong approach. And equity work is very, very different from equality work. And then, of course, there are ideas of justice, right? Which is to destroy the obstacles, break down the barriers to someone's success so that so we can get to equality. One of the criticisms of this graphic is that the foundations that people are standing on are still unequal. So somehow this would have to be like paved over so that everyone has equal footing to begin with. But these are, some of the concepts that I am now infusing, and many of us are infusing very strongly into our science work. So more practically, I do want to, talk about, well, how can we try to decolonize conservation, right? So we're talking about equity, inclusion, and justice, but some of this goes as far as decolonizing the mindset when it comes to conservation. And from my perspective, a lot of that starts with how we educate ourselves, or how we are educated about environmental sciences. And I'm going to really focus much more on conservation sciences. So I have some ideas here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting into them, but different ways that we can try to start to decolonize how what we are taught and how we're learning. And one is to focus on people of color and the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and to understand, achievement in STEM, or in environmental or conservation sciences, and to really reframe how Black, Indigenous, and people of color are achieving in STEM, and try to piece apart, well, what is making someone achieve? I suggest that we all try to do more to deliberately question some of the white supremacist foundations of science, of conservation, and of science norms. And I also suggest that we get into practice of acknowledging some of the racist foundations and some of the founding fathers, some of the people who we've been taught are the heroes of this movement, and understand that a lot of their viewpoints were flawed and extremely, extremely harmful. So when we talk about reframing achievement in STEM, there are some tricks here that I'm suggesting that perhaps, we question, well, what areas of STEM or of conservation or of environmental science are Black, Indigenous, and people of color most successful in, and why? Arguably it's not wildlife ecology. We don't see, in America at least, we don't see too many Black, Indigenous, and people of color showing up in wildlife ecology. So why? Are Black, Indigenous, and people of color showing up strongly in the medical sciences? And why? So really trying to get realistic and understand what, where people are achieving, and whether it's because society has broken down barriers, or just because big numbers have been fighting through barriers. That's a really big difference. How does all of this relate to socio-political movements, again, and barriers? And then how has history played a role? How has history played a role in the prevention of Black, Indigenous, and people of color to get into fields like wildlife ecology? Really untangling that and getting real and getting locally and specifically local and specific information can help us disentangle some of these questions. And then, some more challenging things, but understanding that we have been miseducated in a lot of ways when it comes to our scientific and environmental understandings. And learning to question, what is a white supremacist patriarchal foundation of what we've learned? We know that Western science has dominated, but why and where and how, and is that necessarily the right thing? In particular in America, how people like me were taught conservation was with a complete erasure of the way that many indigenous groups around the world held similar values and practices. I don't know that we would call it conservation necessarily, but how it was a more original way of being, and yet conservation is attributed to Western white thinkers. An example that I like to use for my younger students is to talk about the names of wildlife species. So if we think about, an African lion, and we know that in English it's a lion, and the Latin name is Panthera leo. There are so many examples of wild animals where we know their common name, which is typically English, and the Latin name, but never the indigenous name. And I can't think of a single reason outside of just a racial hierarchy why folks in a typical standard education system are never taught an indigenous name of an animal. because it was not Latin-speaking people or English-speaking people likely that first encountered that animal. And incorporating this slight change could really be a great signal and symbol of taking action to decolonize environmental education. This is just an example, but it's one that I think comes to mind for me very, very often because I'm always talking about wildlife names. I also have little kids, so I'm always talking about cool, fun animals. And I'm doing my best to give them a more rooted, Indigenous-centered education and learning about wildlife, and I think you should too. And then finally, you know, there has been a lot of movement, especially from conservation organizations, to acknowledge that some of the founding fathers of Western conservation were harmful men. And understanding that John James Audubon, who was a slave owner and a pretty brutal, terrible guy, Teddy Roosevelt, who said and believed some really terrible things about Native Americans. The quote that I pulled from Smithsonian Magazine earlier is Roosevelt saying, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. John Muir, who I definitely grew up believing was one of the purest, most wonderful men and, you know, forefounders of conservation, held some really difficult to swallow beliefs about Native people and also about people who lived in poverty as less than. Aldo Leopold, very similar. And, you know, again, these people aren't alone. We can look at people outside of the conservation and environmental movements who are heroes in American history who held extremely racist beliefs and were very, very harmful and actively sought to keep people, non-white people, down and oppressed. Another way that I really think we can start to decolonize and really reframe our understanding and education in the environmental field is to elevate hidden figures. Right? So when we talk about history, when we learn about the history of people and the environment, to truly understand that many, many heroes are Black, Indigenous people of color who have been deliberately left out of whitewashed history. Just, you know, a quick exercise, I'll give you guys the answer. You know, on the left here is a man named Holt Collier. He was born into slavery in the mid-1800s, and he was an extremely gifted wildlife expert. He was cited as the best bear tracker in Louisiana for the Louisiana black bear in the late 1800s. He was the person who helped Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt went on a trip to Africa where he went hunting and killed about 11,000 animals, and then returned to the United States and said, "Oh, I really want to hunt a Louisiana black bear. Those are special." It's a subspecies of American black bear. And unpaid and unacknowledged, Holt Collier was able to organize and successfully allow Teddy Roosevelt to hunt his black bear. This is the bear that after the bear almost killed Holt, Teddy Roosevelt rejected it and said, "No, it's not good enough." Holt got him a different bear, this time a female with a cub, and Teddy Roosevelt killed the female bear and then said, "I just can't kill the cub." And word got out to the press that Teddy Roosevelt had mercy on the bear cub, and they started calling it Teddy's Bear. Then they started selling stuffed animals, and that's how we got teddy bears today. Anyway, all because of this guy who was never paid and never acknowledged. And then the amazing woman on the right is Harriet Tubman, and she is quite well known and quite esteemed and quite celebrated, which is awesome. But rarely do people acknowledge her nature expertise as well. Harriet Tubman used to, on the Underground Railroad, while she was bringing slaves, enslaved people from slavery to free states, she would listen to, study, and master owl calls. So that in the middle of the night, when she and the escapees had to run through the forest, she would mimic the calls of owls in the swamps of Virginia and Maryland in order to communicate with other people in the Underground Railroad about where to go and where was safe. Harriet Tubman was known to study the movements and the behaviors of large carnivores like black bears to understand where they would den every night and what time they would leave, so that she would hide the escapees in the bear den after the bear would leave in order for them to sleep during the day while the bear was out and then continue to run at night. That also masked their scent from the dogs that were chasing the escaping enslaved people because the den smelled like a bear. Harriet Tubman was successful because she mastered the natural world and mastered wild animal ecology in particular. That's amazing. And a lot of these people are hidden figures in environmental history, and we can disrupt that, and we can change that, and we could re-educate ourselves and re-educate our students and create an inclusive, decolonized future. I could go on, but I'll just give another example. Lewis and Clark. So I spent a lot of time working in Montana on grizzly bears, and it's Lewis and Clark this and Lewis and Clark that, and I know we're in Washington, and Lewis and Clark's really important here, but man, they were some not nice folks. They were slave owners. They were very brutal people who owned human beings. This man, we don't know whether his first name or last name was York, but he was called York. He was one of the reasons that the Lewis and Clark expedition was successful. On multiple occasions, he saved both of those gentlemen from death. He fought off bears and mountain lions and wolves for them. He carried them across the landscape on their journey when they weren't able to go to carry on themselves. He was enslaved the entire time of the Lewis and Clark expedition. They promised him his freedom at the end of the expedition, and when the end of the expedition came on the Pacific coast, he was denied his freedom and was sent back to slavery and died there as an enslaved person. So we could go on, but essentially there are some solutions for how to decolonize this work and do better. And essentially, that is what I am attempting to do in my work, what I encourage you all to do in yours, and what I'm going to start committing to teaching. So with that, I think that we can take some questions and let this sink in. Thank you very much for having me.
A reminder, if you'd like to ask questions in the room, please come up to the front and use the microphone. And for those of you listening or watching online, type your questions into the chat. What a wonderful talk and a way to end with some really specific suggestions of things that we can do. Thank you for those thoughts and suggestions and just being able to relate so openly and honestly your own experience. And your discussion of the meeting in Sacramento, which you didn't name, reminds me that I was at that meeting.
Oh, neat.
And I'm sure I experienced a very different meeting than you did. And I think that your relating of your own experience in that meeting is another reminder to me of the ways in which we navigate spaces differently as different people. And I think of that meeting that happens annually as a relatively unwelcoming space for a lot of people, but I think that particularly for minoritized individuals, it's a somewhat hostile place, as are a lot of scientific spaces. Yeah. Have you seen progress in your navigation of these spaces, of at least acknowledgement as we've experienced the last couple of years, and the conversations that we're having here are happening everywhere in terms of the ways in which major scientific societies are taking them up, and if not, what can we do in those spaces to make them more welcoming?
Well, thank you, Dan, for that question. I wish I had known you then. Absolutely, I have seen a lot of progress. I absolutely have seen progress. And so, in fact, so much progress that sometimes I really doubt, well, should I tell this story? Should I, express these things? Because I know that today in 2022, at a minimum, there have been discussions, there has been acknowledgement, there has been a lot of the discomfort of confronting social issues as truly a part of environmental issues in education. Certainly not enough progress, but absolutely. I don't know about at conferences necessarily, but for professional societies, for institutions, for nonprofits, for schools, I have seen a lot of progress. And with that said, I will say that one of the things that really bothered me a couple years ago, and still today, but mostly during the Trump administration, after Donald Trump was elected, there were so many marches going on, right? There's a lot of protesting, right? And we had the March for Science, right? And that was the first time there was ever a March for Science, right? And so at least in my scientific community, people were showing up, right? We were marching for science. And I mean, we, like everybody, that was important. And there was a women's march, right? Because women's rights were and still are, in a lot of jeopardy. And so like folks were showing up and, people who don't identify as women were coming, and it was this big, a lot of energy. People from my scientific community were there. But then the marches for Black Lives, like not so much, like maybe a couple, but like not so much. So I see people, really very visibly see people show up. I'm gonna march for science, I'm gonna march for women, I'm gonna put on a pink hat, I'm gonna do all the things and make signs, but like, oh, I don't know about Black lives. And so, again, it's different for me. I am a woman and I am a scientist and I am Black. So for me, all three of those marches are really important. And for hundreds, thousands of other Black female scientists, that's important. So there's much more that can be done symbolically at a minimum, and then definitely at a deeper level. And again, so much of what I talk about and what I feel comfortable talking about is from the Black perspective. But I mean, we can talk about people from, who have immigrant backgrounds, who, are from strongly oppressed religious groups, who are from parts of the world that are under fire. I mean, there's so many different target groups socially today that it's important for our scientific community to show up for and support in order to do better science, more focused, less distracted, more meaningful science.
We have a question typed into the chat, and feel free to come up from within the room as well for other questions. It's a question about connecting white-dominated universities with HBCUs and opening pathways for people of color. Have you seen examples of that? Have you, I know you went to Emory and Yale, so not exactly HBCUs, so have you seen programs like that work?
Ooh, so thank you to the person virtually who typed that in. That's a really good one. It's a tricky one. I have never attended HBCUs, but HBCUs are very important to me, also to my family. My father is a professor at Howard University, which is a notable HBCU, and he's been there for a long, long time and loves it. There are programs out there for sure. So, even today, students at HBCUs can study, instead of studying abroad, you can study domestically at a predominantly white institution. And those programs are available. A lot of HBCU students choose to attend those universities because it's a safe space. It's a safe space to learn as a Black person in America. For similar reasons that maybe a person would choose to go to an all-women's school. And so often the desire isn't necessarily to leave that learning environment. But there are programs, and even outside of education institutions, there have been more and more HBCU supporting programs. So just last week, the US EPA announced a very targeted partnership with our country's HBCUs to create a pipeline for careers in the EPA directly for graduates of HBCUs, which is phenomenal. So that is, the Environmental Protection Agency, the environmental field is now dedicating more resources, trainings, and opportunities directly for people from those historically Black colleges and universities.
Thank you for such a great talk. So this is a very naive question, but I want to get your opinion. So I teach statistics as well as wildlife. First year I thought, okay, that I was really thinking about this. I'm not going to use all these data sets from Fisher. We know he's a terrible guy. Then I thought maybe I should be teaching and still saying these things and pointing them out. And I'm curious, where do you fall on this? How do we balance these historic figures who had been big impacts on our field and sort of then ignoring that or not teaching it? So I'm trying to figure out, like, what's the right place? How do we do it? Or suggestions or thoughts about how to teach this type of topic where we want to still, there's progress that we're building on from people, but then also recognizing sort of their historical.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that can be tricky. And I'm glad you asked for my opinion, because it's just an opinion. But to me, I think it comes down to, or I should say an analogy would be thinking about political identity, right? Because there is a big difference actually between being liberal and being radical, right? And both are like kind of in the same vein, right? They're leaning the same way. But being liberal has these boundaries, and being radical kind of goes all the way in one direction. So I'm going to say this sloppy, but it's my opinion. I think a radical approach would be to not teach the work of harmful people, full stop, to erase them from the scholarship. And perhaps a liberal approach is to teach their work and include messaging about the harm that they caused. And so it is your choice, and for anyone else who is grappling with this, it is your choice, but do understand that there is a radical approach. And we deal with this in so many different ways, especially in the classroom, but if you think about conservation, I mean, even, I'm a part of this, right? Like, I have thoughts and ideas and feelings, but I don't necessarily have the power that I want to have. So if you think about, land back, like there's a big difference between acknowledging Indigenous history and existence on a landscape and giving their land back. One is perhaps liberal and one is radical. And we are living, like, we have to kind of accept and acknowledge which space that we are choosing and living with. And so, yeah, so that's kind of how I would frame it. It's a lot of analogies there, but I'd say it's up to you. But there is, there's like an all the way and a part of the way version.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was awesome. I was thinking in terms of you presenting at that conferences years ago, and couldn't help noticing that we are still in a place today where a lot of audiences that I'm sure you're addressing are still very different in their experiences, and probably majority white audiences, since this is a scientific context, and that's something that we want to change. And thinking about in terms of this is a collegiate level setting, and what your thoughts are in terms of whether there's been a shift towards pushing sciences as an option for people who are Black or Indigenous or people of color youth, and whether you yourself have addressed settings where childhood educators are more prevalent in that, or whether you see an emphasis on that today.
I love this question, and it's really tricky, as you can imagine. I can't actually answer your question. But I am in a lot of conversations about, and I actually have a front row seat to a lot of discussions about girls and girls' participation in STEM. So this is wider than what you were asking, but there's a time period in the education of girls around, like, I believe 8 or 9 years old, where they seem to drop out of their interest in STEM. And we're finding that it's because of, of how girls are socialized in America. They're often socialized to kind of be perfectionists in a certain way. And so, forgive me because this is not my area of expertise, but I believe, if I understand it correctly, the idea is that when girls feel that they are good at something, it's because they're always getting it right. So, when you're doing kind of low-level math, first grade, second grade, they're more likely to get the answers right every time. And they're like, oh, yeah, I'm good at math and science. I get the answers right every time. But socially, somehow, we as a society are telling girls that, like, if you ever get something wrong, you're not good at it anymore. And so once girls start to confront more complex equations in math or scientific concepts, if the first time they get something wrong, they think, oh, I used to be good at science and math and I'm not anymore. But I'm always getting, my English lesson right, or my, history quizzes right, so that's what I'm good at. Whereas America has socialized boys to think, well, it's the effort that counts. So as long as you're trying hard and working hard, you're good at whatever you're doing. So whether they're getting all of the questions right in math and science or just some of them, if they actually care about, the effort they're putting in, then that's enough. And so it's not that girls aren't ever performing as well as boys. In fact, I believe the measurements is that at young ages, girls are performing better than boys slightly in math and science, but the way that they're socialized actually affects their self-esteem and confidence in terms of moving forward. Now, that was not your question about race and the pathways into science. And I don't necessarily feel that I can answer that, but one thing I will say is that I have been involved several times in trying to coach or work with environmental organizations to change their diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies to become more racially diverse and inclusive. And I've found that I have a bit of a hang up with that, because I feel that a lot of folks go into that work and say, and kind of feel like I'm working really hard to make change in my environmental organization or in the outdoors. And yet they're maybe not bringing that to their place in society as a whole. Does that make sense? So for example, if we create a really, really great national park system where people of color in the national parks, everyone's all together, it's a safe place, people are happy, having experiences, environmental education, all of that in the outdoors, it doesn't actually really matter if the police shoot you when you're driving home to your house, right? That's a wasted effort, in my opinion. And so that's why I want to caution all of us, myself included, caution us to not really funnel our advocacy and justice work just into the environmental portion, or just whatever our profession is, just into that professional space. It's society as a whole that needs to improve. It's really hard to think about well, what type of ecologist do I want to be? When your community's under fire. It's really hard to dream that big. And so I really do feel that it makes it very intimidating, but I feel very much that we as a society need to tackle issues of justice society-wide in order to do better science, to have more powerful science, in order to meet those environmental goals. Thank you.
I have one more question online, which I think is a nice way to end. You've been very generous with your time. Thank you. This is a personal reflection on your comment about John Muir, and you said you held John Muir in high regard, and now you've learned more about his flaws. Are you able to celebrate him for his contributions while also holding him accountable? And I think this goes back similar to the earlier question about teaching. He said, and he follows up, or do his flaws overwhelm his contribution? I'm struggling with this myself, and I'm curious about your perspective.
Oh, gosh. Well, I can say that or I should speak to the person. I should say that I share your struggle. That's really, really hard. And here's another just analogy, because so many of these social issues are, reflected in a different system. There are some really amazing musical artists, for example, who have made a huge impact on my life for the better in terms of their music. And they are people who've been extremely harmful, absolute monsters in society to individuals. And so that has been a struggle for me personally. I think probably all of us here can kind of reflect on how this has shown up in our own lives. Because it's hard, it's hard to really admire a person, perhaps personally benefit, from the work that another person did, and also know that the harm that they caused, in my opinion, makes them unworthy of celebration. I don't think it's a good idea to erase history, but for someone like John Muir, who got a lot of accolades and acknowledgement for his ideas, there's a lot of people who probably shared his ideas that were silenced or invisible at the time that he was a spokesperson for conservation. So I would say keep that in mind. There's he wasn't the only brilliant person at the time, and his mind was muddled with racism and different types of harmful belief systems. Whereas I could bet there are people out there at that exact same time, walking the earth, who did not have hateful belief systems, who could probably articulate conservation values very, very well and did not have the opportunity to. History is tough because it's in the past. There's nothing we can do about it, but we can do better moving forward. And doing even a little bit better can make a big difference. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Wynn-Grant. What a wonderful thought to end on.